Jane was desperate for a rich husband. She would do anything for money and a lavish lifestyle once more. But she did not know what the charming man at the party had in store for her. Hi, my name is Shar, and this is the And Other Stories podcast, where I tell stories of the supernatural and criminal, both real and fictional. Diamonds. She swept into the glittering party with all eyes on her. Fiddling with the chunky jewelled necklace strategically placed on her décolletage, she eyed all the prospects in the room. Her real diamonds were the things she missed the most, but so long as they didn't look too closely, they would never know. The cardboard tags on her dress itched in the middle of her back, and she pulled the old mink stole tighter, hoping it wouldn't show the tattered edges. A waiter approached her with a tray full of bubbling champagne, and she put on her most winning smile as she whisked a glass off the tray. She took a large gulp and walked off, shaking her shoulders, taking a deep breath, and delving deeper into the party. It had to work this time. She was running low on connections and strings she could pull to be invited to these parties. This had to be the one where she found him. When her husband had died, she had been outwardly the dutiful mourning widow, but inside she was ecstatic. His fortune would all go to her. Her carefully laid plan of seeking out a rich old man and making him fall in love with her had not been difficult. Her blonde hair, her low-cut dresses, her scarlet lips. She had known from a young age how to wrap a man around her little finger, and growing up poor, she had always known she wanted more, much more. As a child, she learned how to make the boys give her whatever she wanted. Even the men followed not long afterwards. Her rich husband was the big project, but it had been so easy. A lavish party, a weak old gentleman, a bat for eyelashes and a slow touch of his arm. Soon she had convinced him of her desperate love for him, her desperate hurry to be married. He had hidden it well, though. An old money family, he still had the penthouse, the cars, the name, but he hadn't told anyone about the gambling and the bad investments. She had sat in disbelief as they came and took everything around her. Her dresses and real diamond necklace, the fine furniture, and eventually the penthouse apartment. In no time at all she was sat in a rat-infested studio, listening through the thin walls to the husband beating his wife for being late with the dinner. Her smile faltered as the couples around her eyed her up and down and then closed ranks. With an awkward, breathy laugh, she took another large swig of her champagne and sashayed around the edge of the room, reaching the corner and taking a moment to let her mask of confidence drop, before turning again with a huge, slightly exaggerated smile. A burst of laughter from across the room caught her attention. A group of people were gathered around something, each with rapt concentration on whatever sat in their midst, fake laughs, and each trying to get the attention of the main attraction that was, as of yet, invisible to her. She approached carefully, smiling and saying hello to those she saw on the way, and receiving nothing but a cold shoulder in response, until she reached the huddled group and could see what the crowd was fawning over. A very elderly gentleman sat in front of them, a butler to his side passing him his whiskey whenever the old man gestured with a shaking hand. He wore a fine tuxedo that must have once made a fine party outfit, but now hung slightly loose on his aging frame. In his left hand he fondled a long black cane, and at the very top, used as the round handle, was an enormous diamond. She launched herself forward through the group and straight to him, ignoring the protests that erupted from the gathering crowd. Offering her hand to be kissed, she leaned forward, arching her back and separating her lips in a pout. "Hello, honey," she said in a low, seductive purr, which had worked so many times before. The old man took several seconds to look up at her, his head bobbing with shakes. His milky and occluded eyes roved over her face before his features started to crease even more deeply into his wrinkled skin. Frowning and grumbling, he started waving his hand as if to shoo her away, like she was a fly that he was too weak to swat. Another man grasped her arm, and she stood up, stunned and rejected, backing away in disbelief. "Do you know who this is?" The man spat at her furiously. She looked at him shocked, mouth open and shaking her head softly. "How did you even get in here?" He looked around as if he would find an answer in the gathering crowd, and she started to mumble, sorry, as she backed away with all eyes trained on her. Before she could consider her swift exit, something grabbed her hard on the arm and turned her round so fast the room became a blur. The faces only came into focus as she was pulled backwards through a door. The last thing she saw was the angry faces of the rich and powerful, in their glittering jewels and expensive clothes, before the door shut and there was darkness. A glow bloomed with the small roar of a match lighting. The hand to whom the match belonged then proceeded to light 3 candles, slowly, one at a time. Finally, the man who stood before her brought the match to his lips and lit the cigarette they held, before leaning on the wall next to him and casually breathing out a plume of smoke. In the candlelight she studied his features. His square jaw, his strong shoulders, his dark, slicked-back hair, and his steel blue eyes, all made her breath hitch. He looked at her, watching him in silence, and gave a half smile, before slowly looking her up and down. He stroked his chin with perfectly manicured hands, and stood upright, taking a slow step or two towards her, pinning her slightly in the corner. He leaned into her. She could smell his expensive aftershave, rich and masculine. "I know you don't belong here," he said, low and smooth, before drawing back with a smile. She looked at him defiantly. "I was invited," she said loudly. He reached up his hand to her chest and gently picked up her fake diamond necklace. "These say otherwise," he smirked, dropping them and looking up at her once more. "Don't worry, I won't throw you out or turn you into the mob." He gestured with his head back into the party room. "But I know why you're here. I know what you're looking for." Without stepping away from her, he took another draw on his cigarette before stubbing it out on the table that also held the candles. He then reached into his pocket and smoothly drew out a small package wrapped in black silk. He held it up in front of her, looking straight into her eyes, still with his half smile, and slowly opened the material. Nestled in the expensive silk, shining like stars, were 7 sparkling diamonds of various sizes. Her eyes grew wide as she looked at them, She wondered what kind of man walked around with not one, but several diamonds in his pockets to show to women. A rich man, and a playboy no doubt. But one thing she was sure of, he had her attention. She raised her hand slightly towards them, and he quickly snapped his hand closed and put the package back in his pocket, lifting his other hand to lean on the wall behind her, drawing their bodies even closer together. He bit his lip and tilted his head to one side, his eyes still locked on hers. "Have dinner with me tomorrow," he said after a long pause. It was not a question. Where? She found herself breathing out the question before she had thought it through. At my house. I have a small place up north a little from the city. It'll be just me and you. His voice dropped on his last statement, leaning closer to her, and she felt his sweet-smelling breath, just with a hint of bourbon, as he spoke. "Okay," she said in a daze. She felt like she was frozen by his stare. He drew back quickly as she said that, reaching behind him and grabbing a coat off the hooks on the wall of the hallway they stood in. "I'll send a car at 8. He turned, lighting another cigarette as he walked, along to the end of the corridor and out the door, without a single glance back to her, her blood coursing hot through her body, and wondering what she had just agreed to. She fiddled with the curlers that would just not stay put in her hair. The dress seemed faded, and the necklace looked as cheap as it was. To her, anyway. She could not put the diamonds out of her mind. Their shine floated behind her eyelids, and, penetrating through that picture, was the sharp blue gaze of her mystery party companion. If she played this perfectly, then maybe, just maybe, this could be it. The rich husband with the good looks and charm. She had dared to dream. The red lipstick was sliding over on its second coat when she heard a car beeping its horn outside. She rushed to the open window where the hot city breeze blew in, making the inside just as hot as outside, and her jaw dropped when she looked down to the road and saw a shining Rolls-Royce. She didn't know anything about cars, but she knew money, and she knew that during her short marriage she had not even been allowed to ride in the Rolls. And this man had sent one to pick her up, a complete stranger, with nothing to offer him. She wasted no time skipping down the stairs in her peep-toe pumps. She had worn them the night before, but because they were the only pair she owned. The only hope she had was that, as a man, he would not notice. Sliding into the leather seat, she felt like she was home. The chauffeur had opened the door for her without a word, and quickly and efficiently made his way back to the driver's seat before she had even looked up. This was it. This was the way she should live. Cars, jewels, clothes, the beautiful wife of a handsome, rich husband. She laid her head back and sighed. It was nearly in her grasp. The ride had taken what felt like hours. She had been so eager to get there that the miles upon miles of pitch-black road had frustrated her. But finally they had slowed and turned. A large gate had loomed high out of the reach of the headlights, wrought iron with fancy twists and shapes, and thick, old stone pillars either side, which connected to a high wall that stretched off and disappeared into the darkness. A man appeared from the side, apparently waiting patiently for them to arrive. He laboriously opened the heavy gates, and the car advanced further. She leant forward, grasping onto the leather of the front seat, her eyes wide with astonishment. Up on a slight hill in the distance, the lights from a huge house glowed brightly. She lost count of how many windows were illuminated as her attention was caught by the gardens. Sprawling dark hedges were lit up all the way down the hill toward them along the meandering driveway. Fountains sprayed light into the air in several places. This wasn't just a little place. This was a mansion. And she wanted so badly to be the lady of the mansion. She should have been expecting it, but she wasn't. Her stomach danced as she approached the door, assuming it would be him that opened it. But a very stiff and straight butler stood in the foyer, simply gesturing which way she should go. Her steps echoed off the marble as she walked. The sweeping staircase before her was split into two, before joining again in the middle, high above, to reach the second floor that was out of view. She walked forward and under the chandelier, glancing back to the butler to see if this was where she should go, then looking back ahead of her to the large, ornately carved wooden doors. Her palms were slick with sweat on the gold handles when she used her full effort to pull it down and open the door. He stood at the side of the room, his back to her, one hand in his suit trouser pocket, and the other hand cradling a bowl-shaped glass of brandy, admiring a large painting on the wall. She almost felt frozen to the spot, but she put on her dazzling smile and swung her hips as she walked towards him. He turned around and watched her approach him, face set in an unreadable neutrality, as he looked her up and down, as if judging her on something. "Welcome," he said, his voice gravelly, as he held up his fingers to gesture to another butler at the end of the room, without even looking at him, and she was brought a tall glass full of bubbling champagne. She took it, and with a cheers and a nervous giggle, she took a large sip. He sipped his brandy in silence as he still watched her. "Shall we?" he said finally, holding his hand out, palm up, indicating to the dining table in the middle of the room. It was long and had a crisp white tablecloth. Sets of 3 candle holders were all down the middle. She sat in her seat at one end of the table, while he held out the seat for her. 4 sets of fine silver cutlery lay either side of an elaborately painted plate, which the butler quickly whisked away and replaced with a silver domed dish. Her mystery date walked to the opposite end of the table and sat down, no plate in front of him, and continued to swirl his brandy as the butler lifted the dome from her plate. It revealed a thick steak, seared with lines on its surface, red juices oozing from it, and when she cut into it, the flesh was bright scarlet. "I hope you like rare," he said, loosening his tie. "Are you not eating?" she asked, reluctant to take a bite of the practically raw steak. "I'm not one for dinner, really," he said, smiling, and took another sip, leaving her to wonder. "I don't even know your name," she said after a short silence. He simply smiled his half-smile, his eyes twinkling, as he gestured again to the butler, who brought over a deep, rich-coloured red wine, and she took a sip. "What were you looking for last night, Jane?" It was the first time he had said her name, and it made her stomach leap, but she had no idea how he even knew. "What do you mean?" "You liked the diamonds," he said, with no inflection of a question. "Yes," she gulped. "Is that what you want, Jane? Money and jewels?" "Not just that," she said, taking another large gulp of wine. He surveyed her for a long moment, "Would you do anything?" he said with a slight smirk. "What do you—" Jane started to ask, but the room started to swim. She put her hand to her forehead and tried to stand up. The last thing she saw was his smile, slouched back in his chair, swirling that brandy, before everything went black. She could feel the cold floor on her cheek before she remembered what had happened. Her brain started to work slowly, and her heart hammered into overdrive, and she snapped her eyes open. But there was no difference. She opened and closed her eyes a few more times, but it was pitch black either way. She pushed herself up slowly, head still foggy, and her limbs aching at every movement. On all fours she started to move forward, patting the ground and reaching ahead, hoping to find something solid, the edge of the room, or, even better, a door. Eventually her fingertips brushed the corner of the room, where wall meets floor, dust and dirt settling under her fingernails as she followed it along, and then pressing her palms onto it, and finally turning and resting her back onto the wall. She sat for a moment panting in fear, until another noise reached her ears. In contrast to her breaths, in the small silences between them, was the sound of another. She held her breath and listened. Not many meters away, she could hear it clearly now. The slow in and out of someone or something else, breathing slowly and calmly. Her heart beat against her chest, and cold beads of sweat started to form on her face as her shaking hands started to feel along the wall, away from the breathing. Slowly, stumbling, struggling to get enough oxygen into her lungs, she felt her way as fast as she could, fingers desperate in their search. As she progressed, the breathing started to follow. It became louder and faster as it followed her, not, it seemed, through effort, but through exhilaration. Her nails slammed so hard into the border of the door that she felt one of her fingernails snap. She made so much noise fumbling around for the handle that she couldn't even hear the breathing anymore, or where it was. Her panic reached a crescendo as she finally found a handle, wrenched it open, and stumbled forward into light, blinking and blind. She slammed the door shut and started to run. She ran down the long hallway, richly carpeted in deep red, glowing sconces adorning the wooden panelled walls where there were not large ornate windows. She ran looking back, noticing for the first time that she was barefoot, but then she looked forward and stopped dead in her tracks and gasped. 3 people in suits were stood completely still at the end of the hall, watching her through plain white masks, which had carved into them just the hint of human features, distorted and disfigured, with just dark holes where the eyes should be. As she watched them, frozen in terror for one moment, all 3, in perfect unison, slowly and disjointedly, tipped their heads to the left, as the smaller character in the middle drew from behind its back a long, shining knife. She broke out of her paralysis and turned to sprint in the opposite way down the hall. A large wooden door stood at the end, but she could hear the figures behind her starting to run. Their thudding footsteps muffled slightly by the carpet, but becoming faster and faster. Her lungs burned with the effort of making her legs propel her forwards, faster than the figures behind. She could hear them catching up, the footsteps louder each second. She reached the door and pulled it open just as she heard them right behind her. As she fell through the door and threw her body at it to close it, she felt a sharp pain in her side that almost made her crumple. She managed to close the door with a loud click, and the heavy metal key left in it was stiff and cut into her fingers as she forced it to lock. She sunk to the floor, breathing heavily and trying to feel what had caused the pain on her side. Her hand she used to probe the area came away drenched in red, and she quickly looked down. The expensive silver dress she had purchased with the intention of returning was stained in red, slashed right down her side, and a long wound down her ribs poured with blood. She pressed her hand to it as she curled up in pain. "Hello, Jane." Her head snapped up. She was in the dining room where they had dinner. He stood there, leaning on the large table, tie and suit jacket gone, his two top buttons on his shirt open, brandy still in hand. The doors at the other end and to the side opened, and more people in white masks started to pour in, as she looked from him to them in quick succession. They advanced on her, creeping up, each with different grotesque carved features on their masks, suits and dresses and jewels covering their bodies. Several of the ones at the front grabbed her and pulled her forward to the table. Some others unravelled rope. She was brought to the table and put onto her back, her wound screaming with pain, as they tied her hands and feet, wrapping the loose ends around the underside of the table to secure her. He started to slowly stroll around the crowd, stroking his chin, hand in pocket, casual and calm. "Money, Jane," he said suddenly. "People will do anything for it, and people will do anything with it. I saw it in your eyes when you saw that old guy, when you saw the diamonds, dollar signs in your eyes." He stopped beside her and leaned over, putting his face close to hers. "It's everything, Jane," he whispered, as he gently brushed her hair back from her sweaty brow. "I knew you would do anything for it. You were the perfect choice. See, I could count on you to come, just with a flash of the good stuff. I could count on you to play the game." He paused and looked at her more intently, his half smirk spreading on his face. "Even be hunted. And these people, they're the ones with the money. And they like to hunt." He backed away, giving the access to the masked figures. As they approached, several of them drew long, cruel-looking knives from their clothing. One or two even let out a laugh. The walls seemed to close in on her at the same rate that the group drew in. She started to squirm and wriggle in her bonds. One figure had reached her and started to wave the knife around her body slightly, as if deciding where it should start. It looked up at her and tilted its head, bringing the knife up to her face, and slowly, but with pressure, started to slice into her cheek. She screamed and faced away, trying to take her skin out of its reach, until her leg flew up and out of its bond, and her knee came into direct contact with the masked head. It dropped the knife and staggered backward, gloved hands holding its face as she reached for the knife and cut one of her wrist bonds. She waved the knife violently with her free hand, warning them not to come closer, and they all took several steps back in unison. She quickly cut her other bonds and hopped off the table, backing away to the door from which she had entered at the beginning of the night. She knew that was the way out. Still wildly waving the knife, she reached the door and went through it. The last thing she saw out of that room was the smirking face of her kidnapper, standing casually in the corner. The foyer was empty as she ran across it, drops of her blood staining red on the white marble floor. To her surprise but relief, the front door remained unlocked, and she launched herself out into the warm summer night air. Panting, she looked around. All the lights of the impressive garden had been switched off. The Rolls-Royce had disappeared. She looked around at the horizon, desperate for a hint of which way to go. She wasn't even sure which way it was to the city. As she took a few steps forward to gain a better view, far off to her right, she could make out a glow far on the horizon up the hill. A small cabin or house must be up there, on the edge of his property, and she threw herself forward toward it. After the concrete of the driveway, the grass and twigs of the garden stabbed into her feet, but her survival instinct kept her running, gasping, and reaching for that cabin. It took nearly all her strength to reach the edge of the garden, where the large wall that circled his property cruelly stopped her escape. She glanced behind her, but there did not seem to be any sign of any chase. As she fought to gain control of her breath, she looked from right to left, finally spotting a large trellis propped up against the stone. Vomit rose up in her throat and threatened to stop her as she climbed, but her fear was pumping through her veins like fire as she reached the top and dropped down to the soft grass below. Crouched on all fours for only a second, cradling her ribs, she glanced up to the welcoming glow of the cabin that was now just 50 yards in front of her. Sobs escaped her, and her legs nearly collapsed as she limped to the wooden porch and stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a louder bang than she had anticipated, followed by the quiet click from the keyhole. She looked up. 5 figures stood at the end of the small room she had entered, each with the same white mask. They tilted their heads in unison, and one of them, in a gruff, menacing voice, said, "We were hoping you would escape." Thank you for listening. I hope you liked it. My name is Shar, and this is the And Other Stories podcast. See you next time.